Hello again. Hopefully this is working. I found some Wi-Fi, I think. Let's see if it's actually come through. Let's see if anybody can hear me. Right, people are here, apparently, so that's... Are we back? Okay, I don't know what happened there. Just moving around to different parts of the ship and signal seems to come and go. Where are we? We're on the... actually, try and move that. There's Enterprise's nameplate. Yeah, there's Enterprise's nameplate. We are in a bit of the more public zone of New Jersey, although in sort of a wind shadow, I guess. So yeah, if we're back, then the weird thing is, this entire time, according to my phone, I've just had 5 bars of 5G signal, so I don't know what's going on there. Although, to be fair, there were problems earlier in the day with phone signal, so I don't know if they may or may not be recurring. So yeah, let me just pop my bag and other accoutrements down. Now I've relocated. And since it's nice and calm, I don't hopefully need this on. Actually, no, it is windy, so I'm going to keep that hoodie on. Right. So, questions people might have for me to talk about. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep randomly narrating which bit of the ship I'm on. SPR 5657 says, do you know if US admirals were willing to take more risks with their ship early in World War II because they knew more ships were being built? No, weirdly enough, a lot of US admirals in the very early part of World War II actually were fairly risk averse. Now, that's for a combination of reasons. Firstly, yes, more ships were being built, but they were going to take quite a while to actually get to the front lines, because if a ship is under construction, you need to finish that construction. If it's on the slipway, it needs to be launched and fitted out. If it's being fitted out, it needs to finish fitting out and commission. Once it's commissioned, it needs its new crew, it needs to be worked up, and then it needs to get from wherever it's been worked up and tested to the front line. So, if you're building a ship on the East Coast, like where we are now, if you're in the Pacific, that's a fairly hefty voyage just to get to Pearl Harbor. So just because there is, let's say a Cleveland-class cruiser on the slipway, that doesn't give you license to risk your light cruiser, probably a Brooklyn-class, let's say, because that replacement vessel might not actually be in theatre for 8 months, a year, maybe more. And also, a lot of the US admirals at the beginning of the war were, pre-war admirals. They obviously didn't have much, if any, combat experience, and a lot of them did tend to play things a lot safer. Whereas as you went through the war, obviously various flag officers got more and more combat experience. People were promoted to flag officer from lower ranks, and they had combat experience. And once you get to late 43, 44, and those ships are actually coming online, the new built ships, then it's a matter of, well, we know we have reinforcements to hand, plus we have more ships anyway. And actually, for the most part, you tend to see US officers becoming more and more willing to take risks with their ships the further on into the war that you go. There are a few officers in the beginning of US involvement in World War II who are willing to take a fair number of risks with their ships, but that's because of the character of the officers, not particularly because they're thinking about what might show up, as I say, a year or two down the line. Michael Mouse from the first stream attempt, was it common for crews to use the turret roofs as a spot and other spots for sunbathing? As I say, if I was going to sunbathe on an Iowa class, I'd probably be on the fantail. because the bow, there's a risk of getting drenched by water, and also the captain's trying to navigate and doesn't need to see all that. Whereas on the fantail, it's nice and wide. The teak decking isn't going to overheat massively. Whereas if you're up on the turret, you could probably sunbathe on it with a towel, but the turret is steel, so if it's warm enough and hot enough for sunbathing, it's also going to be, that steel is going to get hot enough, it's going to be painful. Astro Jovino, not New Jersey related, but wondering, it was general naval questions, but wondering about naval footwear in the age of sail. Was there a barefoot crew? Yes and no. Certainly a lot of sailors would go barefoot. They did have shoes. When people recover wrecks of things like Mary Rose and Vasa and ships like that, there are always shoes found. So they definitely have shoes. But of course, shoes are a consumable item. They wear out. They're somewhat more expensive and more difficult to make than they are these days. So if you could, I would think if you could wear some kind of footwear on deck, you probably would. Certainly officers would. But if you've only got one or two pairs of shoes, most of the time you probably keep them in your sea chest and maybe not wear them all day, every day. Because if you've got one pair of leather-soled shoes in the age of sail and you're out for a 6, 8, 12-month voyage, you are going to have worn them out by the time you get back to shore. And when you're ashore, you definitely will need them. Uh, 321, it's Jimbo asks, how different would the night actions of Guadalcanal have been if the US Navy had county-class cruisers instead of the historical heavy cruisers? Very much depends on the other factors in the scenario, because there's not generally much about a county-class heavy cruiser in and of itself that would make it markedly better or worse than a US heavy cruiser of the same time period in the Guadalcanal night actions, with two possible exceptions. One relatively minor, which is, of course, the county-class have torpedo launchers, which the US ships don't, so they would be able to return torpedo fire, whereas US heavy cruisers couldn't, which might be very useful in those close-range actions, actually. But, he who shoots the torpedoes first probably has the advantage anyway. And that plays into the larger factors of why a lot of US cruisers didn't come off particularly well in those scenarios. The other factor, of course, is that if we're talking about precisely mid-1942 county-class cruisers, there is a somewhat greater proliferation of radar on them than there are on US cruisers at the time. And obviously that would be a big advantage in a night action. But if you were going to substitute in county-class cruisers for some of the US heavy cruisers more broadly, then yeah, there might be actually some more significant advantages to that, because you've got veteran crews who are somewhat used to fighting night action, certainly very much more trained for them. And obviously the crew and their response time, much more than most of the technical factors, will make a very big difference. I mean, yes, she didn't survive for Savo Island, but you look at the response time of Canberra compared to the response time of basically any other heavy cruiser present on the Allied side there, and it tells you everything you need to know about how much more capable in a night action a trained Royal Navy crew was in 1942. Dutch 972 says, why didn't the US change its torpedo design in World War II after knowing they were faulty? Well, most of the design issues could be rectified once they were identified, and in the case of the Mark 14, admitted to. The Mark 13, as I documented, had a whole laundry list of issues, but they could be fixed. And ultimately, in almost all cases, it's much faster to fix a problem than it is to just scrap and redesign something from scratch. Because, I mean, the US was designing new torpedoes from scratch during the Second World War, but the fact you rarely hear about most of them in the context of the Second World War gives you some idea of just how difficult a process it is to design and test and deploy a torpedo from the ground up. Obviously, you do get things like the Mark 18, where they're basically rebuilding a German G7E, but then, of course, they have a bit of a head start doing that. But the other thing you've got to remember is that if you can fix a torpedo, then not only would fixing an existing design be theoretically faster, but it also means that all the torpedoes you already have in service can have that fix applied to them, and therefore you have stock. You know, it's no good having a brand new, perfectly working torpedo that you've designed from scratch 3 years into the war, when in those 3 years you haven't tried to fix the issues with your existing torpedoes, because then you have one good torpedo, literally one, and you have to build a ton more before you can actually practically use them. Suvord Man says, have you started hydrating for your oil and steaming class? I've already done that, actually. That was over the weekend down in Baltimore aboard the SS John W. Brown. We passed, which is good. I didn't get blown up by a boiler, which is even better. I didn't get eaten by a triple expansion steam engine, which is better still. And I did get mildly broiled, which was quite enjoyable. Yeah, I would highly recommend Steam School for anybody who has even the vaguest interest in engines. The crew are great, the food is great, the accommodation is great, and, well, you get to play in a giant cavern to massive mechanical machines, which is really good. The Lieutenant Corporal Anime Guy says, do the 16-inch shells have an airburst variant like modern-day 5-inch shells to cause shrapnel damage, etc.? Not particularly, but in theory it shouldn't have been too difficult if you'd wanted to make a 16-inch airburst shell, certainly a knock-together one. I mean, it wouldn't be a full-on shrapnel shell, which would be a true AA shell, but in theory you could take a high explosive shell and strap a VT fuse on it and hook the turret feeds up to the AA fire control system and do something like that. But I mean, it would be a jury rig solution that wouldn't be particularly effective. I mean, battleship caliber heavy anti-aircraft guns in almost all circumstances generally just aren't worth the trouble. But if you wanted to, you probably could have done. R. de Boer asks, was rotor sail technology ever considered for use on warships? Don't know. If you mean modern rotor sails, probably not. They're probably considered far too vulnerable because they're an exposed propulsion system. Cornelius Breddington, did we find out if the AA mounts are trainable? Yes, the 40mm and the 20mm are trainable, but they have little rope barriers on them. They're not, please do not go on this at all, but I think that it's a case of you have to have a docent or a tour guide with you to be able to use them, rather than just, hey, self-guided people, start spinning the 40mm around and potentially clocking other people in the head. Shadow Vale says, have you visited or made a video on USS Intrepid in New York, or do you plan to? I have visited Intrepid back when I was 14. I haven't visited her, this side of becoming a naval historian. It's on the list of things to do at some point, but considering my flight home is in, just after 10, so my flight home is in just under 8 hours. Yeah, I'm not making it to Intrepid this time around. Michael Lima 777, how much power is needed for rotating the radar above you? You can see it going there. I think it's just plugged into standard ship's mains, so 110? I think it's 110. I mean, obviously it's not energized, it's just the motor is rotating. SRR 5657 says, given that the 7th Fleet was guarding Surigao Strait, was it reasonable for Halsey to assume they'd cover San Bernardino Strait as well, since the 7th Fleet was there to protect and support the landings? No. That would not be a reasonable assumption, because the landings were considerably south of San Bernardino Strait, and Surigao was much closer in terms of, which strait is closest to the landing zones. And while 7th Fleet is of reasonable size, it needs to stay close to the invasion fleet to actually do the whole protecting part, and it's not a particularly fast fleet with those slow battleships in it. So while 7th Fleet could, and of course very definitely did, defend Surigao, there's no way that they could realistically cover both, and because you'd either be splitting your forces and leaving both theoretically potentially vulnerable, or you put all of 7th Fleet's combat assets up at San Bernardino, in which case Surigao is uncovered and the invasion fleet is uncovered to AA stuff, AA stuff, aircraft, kamikazes, that kind of stuff. Although kamikaze is only really becoming a thing just about this time. Um, Lieutenant Corporal Anime Guy says, how much of a difference would Admiral Willisley be if Admiral Willisley survived his heart attack or didn't have it at all? What impact would it have made on the war till the end? I mean, when he had his heart attack, the war was essentially over. So his effect on World War II, if he had survived, wouldn't really have been much of anything because, well, he was stateside, and there's no way he was going to be combat deployed in the very small amount of time that was left. But he did have a very important role in further developing gunnery. So it would have been quite interesting to see how the very last 5-10 years of frontline naval gunnery, as in naval gunnery is the primary offence and defence measure, could have developed had Lee been the one in charge of it all. Dr. Thrallable, Drill Thrallable says, I think, did the Royal Navy ever withhold mission details from the US Navy in the Pacific, or was everything always shared? In the early stages of the Pacific War, information sharing wasn't fantastic. It did obviously happen, it had to, but it was, at the very beginning, very ad hoc. So at the very, very start, when the Asiatic squadrons hit, and obviously Pearl Harbor's just been hit, the British are kind of keeping the Americans in the loop on a strategic scale of what they're doing, but the Royal Navy trying to defend its part of Southeast Asia is basically doing things on a day-to-day basis on its own. You obviously then have an attempt to actually coordinate and share everything with ABDA Command. We all know how well that went. And then there was another period of, people still kind of doing their own thing, especially on what you might term a more tactical level, individual missions. But by the time you get into maybe, I'd say, a month or two after the collapse of ABDA Command, then you're talking about most operations being shared. If there was any specific operation that wasn't shared, it was either because it's a very minor operation that didn't impinge in any way on the US area of operations, or it was a top secret mission like say the kayak missions to attack shipping in Singapore, where it was on a need to know basis, and well, if 99.9% of, in that particular case, Royal Australian and Royal Navy Command didn't need to know, then the Americans didn't need to know. They did consider bringing the Americans in, but only if the mission would have required them to sail the MV Crate back through American-controlled waters. Christopher Blalock Fine Arts asks, are we planning on running into Ryan this stream? Unfortunately not. Ryan is in meetings, which is why I'm out here. SSRR 5657, do you have any plans to visit European museum ships like Averof or Aurora? The chances of me I have visited Aurora in the early 2000s, back when I was at uni, but the chance of me ever revisiting Aurora at this point in time, considering she's in St. Petersburg in Russia, are extremely minute. Averof is on my bucket list of ships to visit, probably 2027 tentatively. Because 2026 people have voted on me going across Northern Europe, the tour I was supposed to do basically this year and didn't for various reasons. Brian Kent says, I'm curious to know if you'll ever go into greater details on the Mediterranean command ships like USS Biscayan. Command ships are a very interesting thing to talk about. I do want to do a video on them at some point. It's just not massively high on my priority list. So it might take a while, but it is on the list. DB Fishing Hill says, do you have plans to come to Texas in the US this year? Not this year, as I said. When USS Texas reopens next year, I will. But considering, well, we're in mid-November, I can't afford that many international flights. And, well, the Japan trip was not cheap, shall we say. Jeff Holloway says, I steam 1,200-pound steam plants in the US Navy. It'd be fun to do steam school and steam a triple expansion ship. Yeah, especially considering they max out at about 200 pounds. So you'll be like, really? But yeah, lots of steam operated equipment, and condensers, fuel pumps, everything steam operated, although they start it all off with they've got a very much aftermarket air compressor up on the deck, so they can run the smaller stuff for demo purposes on compressed air. And of course that also means that when it comes to starting up the ship, they can warm up the boilers and then start the auxiliary machinery using compressed air, and then switch over, once the boiler's up to pressure, switch over from compressed air to steam and kind of kick it all off from there, which is really handy because, of course, being a Liberty ship, John W. Brown doesn't have things like auxiliary generators and so forth by default. And if they didn't have that air compressor, they would have some rather interesting times trying to start the engine up from cold every time they did a steam school or tooled up for going around the harbour. 321 Jimbo says, have you considered visiting any of the Coast Guard cutters in the US? Well, I was actually at Taney yesterday because we finished steam school on Sunday, and we popped by Baltimore historic waterfront, historic ships, whatever you want to call them. So I saw Constellation, Torsk, the light ship, and the Coast Guard cutter there, all on our way back here. So that was fun. But in terms of other US Museum Coast Guard cutters, again, if I'm doing a US tour again at some point and they're en route or nearby the route, then sure, I don't have an objection to going to see them. Coppice asks, you should go across the river to the ship in Philly. You mean to Olympia? I ain't swimming, especially not this time of year. Lieutenant Corporal Anime Guy says, have you ever considered going on the Unsubscribed podcast with the Fat Electrician and company to discuss naval history or collab with them? I mean, if they want me, they can invite me and I'll be happy to show up. All right. 321 Shimba says, I don't think he'd go on unsub, but I'd be down to see if the Fat Electrician collab. Well, I don't know what unsubscribe. I mean, I probably should have a look into it, but I have a very long list of channels I'm subscribed to, so I don't know what Unsubscribed podcast is other than the contextual clues you're giving me, which means it sounds like a podcast that you could discuss naval history on. That's as far as my information goes. And well, if there's a podcast where you can discuss naval history and they want me on as a guest, I'm happy to show up as a guest. All other details pending. Alex Prince says, do you think it's strange the US pulled its aircraft carriers from Pearl Harbor a day before the attack? No, because they didn't. Enterprise was on her way back, was due to arrive in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, actually, but didn't because of weather. She wasn't pulled from Pearl Harbor the day before. She'd been out and about for a while. Same thing with the various other carriers assigned to the Pacific. Marco Salmandras asks, good morning, Drac. What are the odds of you coming back to San Diego and visiting the San Diego Maritime Museum? I have visited the San Diego Maritime Museum once, and I think for some bizarre reason, San Diego's ended up as being my most visited US city, because obviously I originally went there to see Midway, but then I've been there for Society for Military History Conference, Western Naval Historical Association Conference, HINSA Conference, and some other conference. I can't remember exactly what it was, but yeah, I've somehow ended up in San... All right, calm down. Let's walk away from that for a second. Okay, that was it, apparently. Yeah, I've been to San Diego quite a lot for somehow. But yeah, again, San Diego is one of the places I may revisit at some point if I end up doing another US tour. Commissioner Sleer asks, are New Jersey's guns aimed at a service station like those on Belfast? No, I think they're just at 20-degree elevation, which is a bit sad because at one point I did suggest sticking 16-inch fireworks mortars in them and firing, broadsides from the main ahead sides, broader heads, considering they're pointed forward, from New Jersey's main battery for like 4th of July celebrations and stuff. Unfortunately, it turns out with her guns at 20 degrees. There it is.
Knockoff ships work.
Thank you. Right, anyway, as I said, it turns out that the ballistic arc the fireworks would fly on would start probably annoying people on that bridge, so that's a bit of a non-starter. SRR 5657, if you're going to Northern, depends where it is. My driving plan loosely consists of Poland, then ferry to Copenhagen, then Sea War Museum Jutland, steam frigate Jylland, Viking ships, etc. Lots of stuff in Denmark. Then heading down to U995, then across to Hamburg, the Type 21, Wilhelmshaven for the German Maritime Museum. There's a few other good museums in that area as well. And then heading over to the Netherlands for the Den Helder Museum. So if the Destroyer Molders is somewhere along that route, then sure, sounds like a plan. Roken X2, if you could magically resurrect any lost or sunken ship in history in perfect condition, what ship would it be and why? Warspite, obviously. Enterprise in close second. Lieutenant Corporal Anime Guy, why did the USSR treat Royal Navy and US Navy Lend-Lease ships so poorly? They were assets they desperately needed, yet when they were given them, they gave them back to us in a condition that was basically scrap them or sell them on. Some of it is a little overdone, not much. They were still in pretty terrible condition. But you've also got to remember that the Soviet Navy, with the exception of its submarine arm, was very much playing third fiddle to the Soviet Air Force and Army in the Second World War. And up until that point, the most advanced thing in terms of big capital ships that they'd had to operate were a couple of holdover gangers, which had been mostly bombed and knocked out of action at the start of World War II. So by the time you get to the end of World War II, you've got a Navy that is very much a distant third in terms of priorities for Soviet defense spending, and which is concentrating most of what it's getting on its submarine arm, and now has the Milwaukee and the Royal Sovereign to deal with, ships that they